please don't panic, but we're going to do a little bit of math. It won't hurt. It's only going to hurt momentarily, but then it's okay, you know. It's not permanent damage. This really started when I was about 9 years old, and I went to my first geometry class at school. It was, you know, I was not doing so well at school because I had all these esoteric experiences, and I, you know, lived in a world in which, you know, I was interacting with all sorts of things and all sorts of worlds out there, and I was more interested in that than what the teacher was saying. So most of the time I didn't pay much attention, so I didn't, you know, I wasn't doing so well. And when the teacher went to the blackboard that morning and said, today we're going to have our first lesson in geometry, and the first lesson in geometry is dimensions, I was like, oh, adults know about other dimensions? I was like so excited, and then I got so disappointed. Because the teacher went to the blackboard and made a little dot like this and said, this is dimension 0 and it doesn't exist. And I was like, oh, this is not gonna go well. I knew from that moment on I was gonna fail that class. Because I was way back, you know, I was always nearest the door. And I could see the dot. So if I could see the dot, how is it that it didn't exist? And then the teacher did something remarkable. He put a bunch of dots together, made a line, and said, this is dimension 1, and it doesn't exist either, because it still doesn't enclose volume. And then he put 4 lines together, made a plane, called it 2D, and said that's the plane that all your comic strip books lives in, and it doesn't exist. And I could see, like, the kids were crushed, you know. They were like, what? And then he did something miraculous. This is the equivalent of the, you know, miraculous Big Bang, you know. He did something miraculous. He took 6 of these planes, put them together to make a cube, called it dimension 3, and said, this one exists. And I was like, huh? How did that happen? You know, because I don't care if you put 100 million non-existing planes together, you don't get existence, right? If the dot that doesn't exist, right, makes the line that doesn't exist, makes a plane that doesn't exist, you don't get existence. You get non-existence to the 4th. Big issue. Why is this important? Well, this is actually the fundamental axiom that most of our physics are written on. And if we, in the math, we write those physics with. So if we have this wrong to start with, if it's incorrect or if it's incomplete, then we're going to get an incomplete or incorrect picture at the end. And so because people learn this very early in their education, it's usually not revisited ever by the physics community. And at the end of the day, then they have superstrings theory and Calabi-Yell spaces trying to solve equation for unification for advanced physics, and they have to add, you know, planes of freedom one after the other to get like 248 dimensions of Calabi-Yell space, and the equations go on forever, and at the end of the day it doesn't add up. All right? So when I was going home from that day, I had this long bus ride to go back to my home because I kept on getting kicked out of the schools closer to my home. A physicist later on told me in a physics conference that that's how I furthered my education. Because I had all this time to think about it, right? And so I'm sitting there, I've got an hour and a half to go, and I'm thinking, man, I gotta solve this dimensional problem. This is not happening. I can't live with this. And I'm thinking, and then the bus is getting fuller and fuller, and I thought, oh, you know, it's getting hot, and so I closed my eyes, and in my mind's eye, I extruded myself from the bus, and I started rising up from the bus, and I saw slowly the bus becoming smaller as I rose further and further, and then I saw the city I was in becoming smaller as I rose further and further and further, and then the continent getting smaller, and then I saw the earth getting smaller, and as I rose further, I saw the solar system getting smaller, and like looking like a dot, and then I rose further and further, and then the galaxy started to look like a dot, and I thought, oh my God, it's dots all the way up. And then I flew back into the galaxy and looked at the solar system and flew back in and went back to the earth and found the bus I was in, and I opened my eyes and I looked at my hand and I thought, I wonder what's in there. I closed my eyes, and in my mind's eye, I flew into my hand, and I saw it was made out of millions and millions of dots we call cells. And then I went on to the surface of one of those dots and looked really carefully, and I got finer and finer, and eventually it opened up like it was stars of dots everywhere, billions of them that we call atoms. And then I went to one of those dots, and I looked in the middle of it, and sure enough, what was there? Another dot. And I was like, oh, it's dots all the way down. And I had this epiphany, you know, like, oh my God, maybe the universe, maybe the answer to the riddle is the exact contrary. The only thing that exists is a dot. The universe makes points of infinite division and assembles them at different scales and make everything we see. I was like looking at the people in the bus, and I could see they were made out of dots and smaller dots and smaller dots. They seemed to glow with a strange aura, and you know, at this moment. And you know, when you have these moments of epiphany, I'm sure many of you in this room had them, you know what you want to do next, right? You want to tell someone, right? And you all know how that goes usually. You get the look like, did you take your medication this morning? And, you know, so I ran home when I got out of the bus, and I waited for my mom to come back from work, and when she got home, I was like, Mom, I figured out something at school today, it's so awesome. And my mom was all excited, like, oh my God, he's actually enjoying school, like, oh. Maybe he had a good exam, you know, for the first time in his life. And I'm like, Mom, today I learned about dimension at school, and they're wrong. I just went over like a lead balloon. And it's like, Mom, you know, I think it's the contrary, that like, the only thing that exists is dots, and you're made out of dots that are made out of smaller one and smaller one and so on. You get infinite amount of dots, Mom. And she looked at me, and she said, you know what, I just worked for 8 hours. I'm real tired. I don't feel infinite at all. It's like if everything is embedded into each other to infinity, is how you get boundary condition. How does things differentiate from each other? This has been a big problem. It's a chasm in our understanding. How does infinity and finite system interact? Typically, we think they don't. And that has shown up in our physics really strongly. So now we have a theory for like big stuff, Einstein field equations, that predicts continuums towards singularity, continuums towards infinity, and we have a theory for the small stuff, for the atoms and the subatomic particles we call quantum theory, and quantum theory predicts bounded linear finite states. So the two don't agree. And so since then we have this thing, and so we have this chasm between the two. Einstein tried to put it together, but he couldn't. And, you know, the problem is that when you look out there, big things are made out of small things. So obviously, those physics must match, right? Well, the chasm is much deeper than that. The chasm between the understanding of infinity and bounded state shows up in our society everywhere. I'll give you an example. Spiritual people tend to think in terms of infinity, that like this infinite potential, you know, that all things have infinity within them and all this. And the scientific community tends to think in bounded, closed systems of finite, you know, rational concepts. And so the two don't agree, typically. The chasm even goes deeper. I think the deepest of that chasm is the difference between female and male. Women typically think in terms of continuum, in terms of curvature to infinity, like infinite possibility. Everything is okay, honey, right? And man thinks, in general, have a tendency to think in bounded state, you know, finite, highly logical systems. And the two can, in some cases, not agree. Statistics on divorce can support that statement, right? And so, but how do you solve it? I mean, there must be a solution, because men and women are here, because scientists and spiritual people are here, because large things are made out of small things. How do you connect infinities and finite systems? And I started to think about it. I realized that there is a simple geometric solution to the riddle. So in a simple geometric solution here, I'm going to prove to you that infinities and finite system are absolutely related. Actually, one cannot exist without the other. And so we'll make a boundary. We'll call it a finite boundary. This is a circle. And it encloses a certain volume, right? It could be a sphere in the space. So don't reduce it necessarily to a circle. And then inside it, we're going to put an equilateral triangle. Now that triangle in a sphere could be a tetrahedron, right? And we can polarize that tetrahedron because the universe has spin. Things spins in the universe, and when they spin, there's polarity. So it's okay, you can polarize it. So you can polarize the triangle. And interestingly, right away, you got an ancient symbol that you can find in many, many different cultures all around the world, although it's best known by the Jewish culture as the Star of David or the Star of Zion. Well, if you look carefully, you find that as soon as I polarized the first tetrahedron, I created new boundaries that have the exact same geometry that I started with. Except these boundaries are one step smaller, right? They're one gradient or one iteration smaller. Well, what's important to remember here that each of these boundaries define a very specific center, right? Like this boundary here, this is its center, and this is its center, and all of the centers are all different from all other centers. That means that each of the boundary, although they are part of a similar geometry that is interactive with each other, meaning one cannot exist without the other ones, they all have their own very specific coordinates in space-time, and they observe the rest of the fractal structure from its own very specific point of view that no other boundary in the system has. You all following this? It's an important point. Now, you can polarize those, and you'll get smaller boundaries again. And again, each one is a very individual boundary. and you polarize those, you get smaller ones, and you can go to infinity doing that. So if I had this program running on my computer, it could keep zooming in and making more boundary and zooming in and making more boundaries, and it would go to infinity. Like, as long as the computer was running, it would keep going. However, I would never, ever, ever, ever escape or exceed the first boundary I've made for myself. So within the context of a finite space, I've embedded infinite amount of information. Infinite amount of divisions. That means that if this is true, and if it's geometrically true, and if it's mathematically true, then it most likely is true. You could take the boundary of any of your atoms, or the boundary of your cells, and divide them and divide them and divide it to infinity, meaning that you have an infinite amount of information, an infinite amount of divisions within yourself. So all of a sudden, you're starting to have a mechanical and mathematical understanding of the infinite nature of your existence. It's no longer just a metaphysical concept. It's no longer a belief or a dogma. It's actually a mathematical equation. Does that make sense to you? So this is crucial, because without it, you're still in dogma. And so, what does it mean to physics? I mean, it means a lot to spirituality and philosophy. But what it means to physics is that if physicists understood that, this simple example, they would stop building accelerators. We keep thinking that we're going to find the smallest particle. Not so long ago, a few centuries ago, we discovered the cells, right? And we thought, oh my God, cells are so small. They must be the smallest thing the universe does. And then we realized cells were made of billions of atoms, and atoms are so small. We thought, oh my God, that's got to be the smallest thing the universe does. The God particle. And then we found, oh, the God particle is made of smaller particles, protons, neutrons. And we went, oh, and they're like bitty little things in a very small thing to start with. And it was like, oh, that's got to be the God particle. And then we found subatomic particles and so on and so on. And it's like, wait, and every time we're finding these new particles is because we're building larger and larger accelerators so that we can accelerate particles at faster and faster rate and collide them together to get smaller and smaller and smaller particle. And now we've built a device that's like an accelerator that's 17 miles long. I think it's cost like $10 billion at this point or something. It's extreme. It took like 5 countries to finance it. Well, those things have a finite limit, meaning like there's constraints on what we can build. So maybe instead of looking for a fundamental particle, a God particle, we should start looking for a fundamental pattern of division. Because if we understood the pattern, then we would understand how the universe creates. We would have the key to the divisions of the space that produce our reality. We would have the key to creation. That could be fairly useful. And so I started to think about that, and I was like, wait, let's ask a fundamental question. If you were asked to point at something in the universe that connects all things, what would you point at? What would it be? If you had all the universe, everything you see, and I asked you, find me something that connects all things, because you hear that a lot in the spiritual world, and you know, from masters that in ancient times and so on, that everything's one, right? But how? If you don't tell me how, then it's just a concept. It's just a dogma. You got to tell me, how is that possible that everything is connected? Like, you got to explain that to me.
Consciousness.
Well, if you say consciousness, you haven't explained anything, because probably every person in this room has a different definition of consciousness. So, what would it be? Space. Very good. Very good. Space is everywhere. It's between galaxies, it's between universes most likely. It's between stars, it's between planets. And at the atomic level, the space is extremely high. Atomic structure, all of your reality is built out of 99.9999999% space. So everything you say is so solid, is so real, that you think of as your reality is actually mostly space. And it's oscillating, and the oscillations interact, and did you know that you actually haven't touched anything at any time, anywhere? Nothing touches? Nothing? The densest atom is like, a molecule is a, diamond molecule. If you grew one of the atom in that molecule, the other one would be 2 football fields away. If the one you grew was the size of an orange. That's how much space there is in between them, and then the space inside the atom is 99.99999%. So maybe we should pay attention to the largest percentage instead of the smallest percentage. We spend a lot of time paying attention to the 0.0000001% that we call matter, and we spend very little time paying attention and trying to understand the 99.9999999% of the space. So maybe instead of matter defining the space, maybe it's space that defines matter. And I start to realize that. You all following me? This is a fundamental change in consciousness, to actually go in the world and first of all realize that you're mostly space, and that maybe the space is defining you instead of you defining it. You are in that mechanism. You are part of this conduit of information of the vacuum that goes from infinitely big to infinitely small through you. And as it passes through you, it picks up your specific interpretation of the universe and feeds it to the infinity of all things, so that your participation is counted. Do you start to get a sense of your responsibility? And so there, we start to feel that connection to all of the scales. But how do we get that feeling of that connection? Just a little side note on philosophy. We get that feeling of connection not by trying to connect with infinitely big, people say, I can't visualize that. Well, that's because your senses are fairly limited. But you have the infinitely small within you. So through that direction, you can connect to infinity. This is why most of the masters that have walked the earth have said, go within. The kingdom of heaven is within. You know, the Buddha is within everything. The Bindu point is within everything. And it's your connection to all knowledge. Right? Right.